Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of VCIA, the European Confederation of Institute of Internal Auditing, I'm very happy to welcome you today for this webinar on the implementation of the global internal audit standards in the public sector. At ECIA, we have a public sector committee that has always discussed about the role and use of the standards in the internal audit in the public sector, because we believe that this is a guarantee of a quality and professionalism of the internal audit function. So now that we have the new global internal audit standards in place since January the 9th, so more or less a week ago, we saw that it would be quite interesting to debate and discuss about the challenges, but also the opportunities of all these standards for the profession and for all the internal auditors in the public sector. And before going in detail and presenting our keynote speakers for today, let me please introduce to you some logistic details. So we will use for the questions, but also to get some input from you, Slido. So please connect to Slido, either via the QR code that you can see here on the slide, or via the PC and the code GIAS 25. This is important not just to interact with us, but also in case you would like to get a CPE certificate at the end of the webinar. And don't worry, we will explain to you how to do it at the end. So I think it's time now to introduce the two guest speakers for today. They are both members of the Public Sector Committee. So first of all, we will have Deborah Mehrhouse, who is Deputy Director, Audit Practice, Government Internal Audit for the Internal Audit Agency in the UK. And I think I may say, Debbie, that you have more than 20 years experience in audit. And you are really in the heart of the implementation of the standards in your country. So very interesting to listen to you and hear your recommendation. We also have Jens Mottel. So Jens has been recently appointed as the head of internal audit for the Hessian Ministry of Science and Research, Arts and Culture in Germany. And Jens is also a member of the board of the German Institute and used to be a member of the ECIA board. And I think I may also say for you, Jens, that you have more than 20 years experience in internal audit and quite challenging, especially in your country, I think, but we will come back on that. So before diving in the details and the challenges of the implementation of the new standards, we believe that it would be maybe interesting just to have a small wrap up about what they are and also what are the main changes compared to the old international professional practices frameworks that we used to have. So Debbie, may I please give you the floor to explain to us and set the scene.
Thank you very much, Pascal, and good afternoon, everyone. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So as Pascal said, we've had a year to learn about the new standards and get ready for them. So this is going to be a very quick recap in terms of what has changed between the two. So in the previous International Professional Practices Framework, we had mandatory guidance, which gave the definition of internal audit, the code of ethics, the core principles and the standards, supplemented with the recommended guidance, so the implementation guidance and the supplemental guidance. The problem with this was that it was very fragmented. The guidance wasn't always read and not always given the right level of focus. So the introduction of the new framework was all about streamlining, simplifying and bringing together the guidance in one place. The new guidance has also introduced new requirements in terms of topical requirements. These are mandatory and cover governance, risk management and control processes over specific subjects. Topical requirements should be used if you have an audit of a particular subject in your audit plan. You do not have to do them for the sake of doing a topical requirement. It is simply there if you are undertaking an audit of that particular area. But it's important to note that you need to follow the requirements on a comply or explain basis. So if you are not covering a specific aspect of the topical requirement because it's covered as part of another audit, then you need to make that clear. They will also form part of any forthcoming EQA. The first topical requirement is on cybersecurity, and this should be finalised this quarter. It will be, I believe, mandated from March 2026. There are further 3 topical requirements that the IIA plan to consult on in 2025. These are third parties, culture, and business resiliency. Okay, so to carry out an overview of the standards, if we can have the next slide, please. The standards cover 5 domains, 15 principles, and 52 separate standards. And it is good to see that in the new standards, there is recognition for both smaller audit teams and the public sector, recognising that resource constraints may impact your ability to conform with all the standards, and that the complexity of the public sector, as recognised in the additional annex at the back, recognises that due to the legal, law and regulatory framework, the governance framework, or the funding framework in place, there may be challenges in how you apply the standards. Now, these are global standards. They can't possibly cover every situation or scenario, but it does make it clear that in the public sector there will be specific challenges, and it's really about how we think about that in terms of our unique situations as to how we apply the standards going forward. So domain 1 covers the purpose of internal audit. We're there to provide the board with independent, risk-based, objective assurance, advice, insight and foresight. We're there to help organisations achieve their objectives in the public interest. Domain 2 covers ethics and professionalism. It covers integrity, objectivity, competency, exercising due professional care, and maintaining confidentiality. And I think there are some specific challenges for us in the public sector around how we make sure that we are acting ethically and professionally. And I know Jens will cover that when we come to look at Domain 2 in more detail. Domain 3 is the governing the internal audit function, and this introduces the concept of essential conditions and really how we set out the roles and responsibilities of the boards, the senior management and the chief audit executive. Domain 4 is all about managing the internal audit function. We start to move into more familiar territory here in terms of how we strategically plan audits and use our resource, and make sure that we're really focused on the performance of the function. Although Domain 4 does introduce the requirement to have an internal audit strategy. Finally, Domain 5, performing internal audit, and probably the most familiar and relatively similar to the previous standards. But there are some tweaks and things to think about, and we'll draw those out as we go through into the specific detail. Pascal, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you very much for this introduction. I think it's time now maybe to share with you the approach that the ECIA working group has taken to review these new standards and try to identify what are the challenges and the best practices that we could share with you. So Jens, maybe could you please explain what has been done so far? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Pascal. We had this project on global internal audit standards as part of the 2024-2025 working program of the Public Sector Committee of ECIIA. And in charge were Deborah and me. And we also could gain 14 internal audit practitioners from various public sector organizations in ECIIA member states that were gained through the National Institute. And with that team, we allocated the principles and standards and shared the work with a set of questions for each standard. And then was the phase of review, discussion, identification of key messages, new requirements and recommendations for the implementation of the standards in the public sector. And those key recommendations we took for the summary. And with that summary, we came back to the public sector committee. We did a review and got feedback from the members of the public sector committee. And after that, we had the opportunity to consult with IIA Global, with the standards and guidance, with public sector knowledge group, and with the internal audit standards board. So this input from IIA was also very helpful to develop the summary and the detailed analysis of the standards in the public sector that were now published.
Thank you, Jens. And maybe last but not the least, so the publication that Jens is mentioning, you can find it on the ECIA website, so ecia.eu, under the section Public Sector Committee. So as you know, the IIA has asked you to assess the compliance that you have today with the new standards. And we believe that it would be interesting to hear from the around 180 participants online today where we stand. So we would like to share with you a first question so that you can let us know how comfortable you are today on 17th of January in terms of conformance with the global internal audit standards. And for those that haven't seen yet the publication from IIA Global, we have shared with you here the different ratings that they apply so that you can tell us where you stand. So we will wait a little bit to give you time to answer. I see that it's quite bad. It's quite good, sorry, because general achievement is number one from the beginning. So good, congratulations. And no achievement is very low, so even better. Let's wait maybe for another few minutes before I will ask you, Debbie and Jens, to share your view on that and where you stand, maybe, if I may. Okay, I think we remain more or less with the same figures, meaning that the majority of the people online today have a general achievement or a partial one. So Debbie, what's the situation on your side?
Thanks, Pascal. That's interesting to see. It's interesting in the UK because although global the standards were effective from the 9th of January, in the UK, we are not implementing them until the 1st of April this year because that aligns with our financial year. And that is a decision the UK public sector standard setters took specifically. So in terms of where we are still working through updating all our manual and guidance to align with the new standards. But we were generally conforming with the old standards, and I think that puts us in a good place in terms of where we will be with conforming with the new standards. We also have the added complication that we have an EQA, which has to happen before the end of this calendar year. So as well as implementing the new standards, we are desperately preparing and making sure that we are have everything in place that we need for the EQA as well.
Thank you, Debbie. What about Germany? What's the situation, Jens, based on your knowledge? You are on mute, please.
In Germany, the situation is quite different. We don't have a national audit office for all the administration. We have 16 federal states, each giving legislation or regulation to internal audit, and not all the legislation has still been adapted to the new standards. So therefore, from the legislative side, we are a little bit behind, but most of the government institutions are working on implementing the standards so that we might have a similar picture to what we have here now in the Slido. Partial achievement or general achievement should be the majority.
Thank you very much for this input. And let's maybe make another test and let's see where you online today, what's your experience with the implementation? Which domain has been the most challenging for you in terms of implementation? And what is your experience? It seems that domain 3 is on the top of the list. Not a big surprise, let's say. Okay, so there is for sure a big number 1, domain number 3, follow slightly by domain number 1, and then the 3 others. So let's see what the working group of ECIA thought about this, and also let's see what you personally think about it. So Jens, could you please tell us what you believe have been the biggest challenges for domain 1 and 2? Let's take both together, if you don't mind. And what are also your recommendations for those that still need to fine tune or even worse, need to implement them?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Pascal. Yeah, the first domain actually is about the purpose of internal auditing. Since the change is not that great, I am quite surprised that you have yeah, challenges implementing this part, because the purpose of internal auditing is meant as an elevator pitch to have a short and yeah brief message what internal audit stands for and what it should achieve. So the main target has not changed totally. It is more clear, more useful to explain the purpose of internal audit. And concerned public sector, there are no special parts in it, because this is a global, yeah, global value of internal auditing that should be used in every profession, in every industry or whatever, in the same way. So these elements are significant for the profession, what internal audit stands for, but there is no big change to what has been before. There are more changes in the domain 2. There we talk about the mandate and competencies, and there in the public sector we have some specialties, because main goals of the organization can change because of elections or other changes in politics, and therefore these changes must be considered by the mandate, and the internal audit unit should observe these changes and develop new targets and adopt the internal audit mandate to the political goals and targets. And one other aspect that we have in the public sector are whistleblower programs. They should be managed independently. They should not be part of internal audit work. And also, we have the need for conflict of interest policies. And this is an important part in the public sector, which reflects in the domain 2 standard. Also, we have a different situation in the professional development. Public sector careers are different to other career paths in the industry or other sectors. There are schemes for civil servants to develop a career, and you often don't find internal audit experts in the public sector because it is a part-time position, and then you do another job in a few years. That's kind of the career schemes that make it difficult to enable con competency and continuous professional development. And yeah, with conformance with the standards, which is also in the domain 2, there we have the problem that many laws and regulations in different countries are not yet adopted to the new standards. They still refer to the IPPF 2017 and not new standards because the legislation has not been adopted recently. And therefore, we have here a point where, yeah, you should require disclosure that you are not by legislation yeah, using the standards, but of course, in the internal audit function, you can still apply them if you are able to. But if there are yeah, problems with conforming, you should make disclosures for that. Also, confidentiality might be special in the public sector because we have a lot of regulation for protecting of information, data security, and other aspects that are uh, yeah, more restrictive than those in the private sector. And therefore, you have to look into the standards 5.1 and 5.2 if there are any needs for yeah, adopting those standards and maybe do disclosures here as well.
Thank you, Jens. Thank you very much. So even though it's not the most challenging, I think there are a few actions quite important to do in the public sector. If we go now to domain number 3, the number 1 on the score, no pressure on your shoulders, Debbie. What do you think are the main challenges of this domain, and what are your recommendations based on your experience?
Thank you, Pascal. And I have to say, I'd probably agree that this for us has created quite a lot of discussion and debate. Because in the UK, the Government Internal Audit Agency delivers internal audit services to over 140 customers. We are a central function as an agency of His Majesty's Treasury. We don't deliver internal audit across every single organisation in central government, but we cover quite a lot of it. And so this for us has been quite challenging in terms of understanding the relationships between us as an agency and our customers and the boards of those customers and senior management. So we've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and I actually had a meeting with my chief executive this morning on this very topic to see where we'd got to. So there's a lot to unpick, I think. But in terms of changes and challenges and how we would deal with those, I think the first thing is to see this as an opportunity to reset, to reshape, to really clarify the roles and responsibilities of the board, of senior management, of the chief audit executive, and how we work together to make sure that the internal audit function is effective. So the first question is, do you understand who your board is? Do you understand the senior management layer? Governance in government organisations can be really complex, and there can be multiple committees. So making sure that you've got the right structure in place and that the right reporting lines are in place is really important. Do you even have a board? Who are you reporting to? Are you reporting to the chief exec directly, or is there actually a board? And I know the ECIAA have been advocating strongly for the introduction of audit committees, and I think audit committees are really powerful. In the UK, we are lucky because every institution has to have an audit committee, and they are the primary board. That is who we would consider to be the board in the organisations that we deal with. So making sure you've got the right structure to start with is really important. Domain 3 introduces this concept of the internal audit mandate. So it specifies the authority, the roles, responsibilities of internal audit, and that needs to be incorporated into your internal audit charter. So as Jens was saying, sometimes laws and regs will brush up against that, will make it difficult for you to be able to deliver your mandate. So one of the key considerations is, do you need to look at the laws and regulations, and can you advocate for their change? Now, as we know, it's not going to happen overnight. It will take time. So you need to think about how you will operate whilst those changes are going through, and how you communicate that and set that out in your audit charter as particular issues. In terms of laws and regulations, that can also have an impact on your independence and how you operate and what your function is, and how you work with, for example, Supreme Audit Institutes. I know sometimes internal audit is seen as a kind of testing arm of the Supreme SAI, and that can make it difficult for you to be able to actually deliver the mandate that you have. So making sure that that is also clear. I think the key thing is really using the audit charter to be able to set out the roles, responsibilities, and where those key issues are. So that might be impairments to your independence if you've got a role that isn't internal audit related, or if you're having problems coordinating with other assurance providers. If you, for example, funding is a significant issue and you may not actually have control over funding. So how do we make sure that you have the funding for the right people and for the investment in technology? What control do you have over that, if any? And can you use the board to help advocate for more funding for the internal audit service? But setting out the budget setting process in your audit charter is useful to remind people about the limitations and what you can and can't do. It can be difficult if the board doesn't engage on quality. So are they interested in the quality of your work? Do they show an interest in the performance indicators? Are they doing that annual review of effectiveness of the internal audit function? Can you get them involved in a conversation on that? And similarly, if you are having an EQA, are they involved in the scoping of that? Are they involved in determining how that will be approached and how often you will do that? Can you actually get someone that has the right qualifications and experience to undertake that EQA? And I know from feedback we had as part of the working group, it can often be challenging to make sure that you have an EQA assessor with the right skills and experience. So promoting the CIA qualification, or also thinking about, can we do a self-assessment and get someone to peer review that instead? Or using peer review across a number of institutions might help if you can create a pool of people who are able to support EQA assessments. There are some tools that have been developed. So the IAA Domain 3 Toolkit gives you an opportunity to talk to the board about the minimum requirements and what those roles and responsibilities should be. And the IIA have also developed a template for the internal audit charter, specifically for the public sector. And I actually used that to compare to our current audit charter and make sure that I was reflecting everything that I needed to for the new essential conditions. So I actually found that really helpful. Pascal, I think that's the main points that I wanted to cover.
Thank you very much, Debbie. And Jens, any recommendation on your side, best practice that you can share regarding domain 3 based on your own experience?
I think in the domain 3, it reflects to domain 4. We have the bonding between the board or head of the organization and the CAE. And there, some of the processes should be put into the internal audit charter to be clarified. That's the same what we recommended. That is really a strong point to be sure that the procedures are defined and that there is clarity how the standards can be applied and how an efficient internal audit function can be established.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's move to domain number 4 now. What's your experience? What are the main challenge and the main recommendation on the 4? Jens.
Yeah, actually, in the domain 4, we have an interesting aspect brought up now. That's an internal audit strategy. And this is an explicit requirement to develop a strategy for the internal audit function that supports the strategic objectives of the organization. And there we, of course, have some special aspects in the public sector because political changes may influence the strategy of the organization and also the strategy of the internal audit unit. And there you can find guidance for strategy at the IIA guidance implementing an internal audit strategy. There you have helpful hints how to develop a strategy. And the first approach would be a SWOT analysis to do and then develop a certain strategy for your internal audit function. Most of the domain 4 is like a job description of the head of internal audit. So therefore, you find standards for coordination and reliance. This is an important aspect because in the public sector, we have a significant number of assurance providers and stakeholders we must coordinate with. And there we have to be clear who these are. And we also have to consider public interest in that standard. And other aspects where have connection to domain 3, as we are talking about financial resources. We talked about the special budget situation in the public sector. And this is also considered in a section applying the global internal audit standards in the public sector. Following the standards, this section gives you really helpful hints and explanations on how to apply the standards in the public sector. And this is very helpful for us to maintain all the aspects of the standards, although procedures for budgets are different, and you should be aware that the budget process might also be part of the internal audit charter, so you can rely on the budget situation and the organizational structures of your organization on how to deal with the budget and how to approach the head of the organization or the board. Similar with human resources, there we have a special situation in the public sector. Positions are given in other ways than in the private sector, and you have also a limited authority of appointing staff than in the industry or in the private sector. So there you should collaborate with the HR function to be able to get staff that is knowledgeable and that can do the job required in internal audit. And with recruitment, you should point out benefits of public sector positions to hire qualified internal audit staff. Technical resources, there Debbie explained the way you should do when you have limits for use of technology. This is kind of similar to the budget situation. You have to address this to the board or senior management in your organization and do all the best to get the right technical equipment and resources to perform adequately. And if you have problems, you should document the reason and the impact of a lack of technology, as explained before. Stakeholder management is also an important part in the public sector because you have to identify key stakeholders and have a plan for managing them. And here also legal requirements need to be considered for the communication with the public and which information might be shared. And it might be also useful, but it should be allowed to obtain input from the public for the internal audit mandates. And another standards in the domain 4 is the concept of performance objectives for the internal audit function. So here you should develop a set of key performance indicators to identify the performance of your internal audit function. And their knowledge sharing is really helpful. So be in touch with other organizations, see what key performance indicators they use. And there you also find a lot of guidance at IIA publication.
Thank you very much, Jens. Maybe a few points for you, Debbie, if I may. So Jens was also insisting on the coordination of the different functions internally, all the assurance provider, also with the external ones. You mentioned also the relation with the external auditors. Do you have any tip? Do you believe, for example, that tools like the assurance mapping or other tools are helpful and are useful also in the public sector? What are your recommendations there?
Definitely assurance mapping, Pascal. Unfortunately, in the UK government, we're not very mature at assurance mapping, and I think it's about understanding the benefit to the organisation and not just being seen as something that internal audit need to do. We've just recently changed our risk assessment templates to actually incorporate more assurance mapping ourselves, so that when we're doing our strategic planning, we can see what assurance we've already built up and who the other assurance providers are. But coordination can be a real challenge, especially if you have external regulators who have their own agenda and don't necessarily even tell you if they're doing a particular review in an organisation. So you may not even know it's happening until after it's happened and the report has been published. So there are definitely challenges, and I think, as we've said, using the audit charter to set out those challenges and explain what you've tried to do I think it's about, you know, have you identified them? Have you tried to coordinate with them? If they're not responding, you can only take that so far without support from the board and senior management. But having an assurance map and having that clarity over what the landscape looks like and who the key people are that you need to engage with has got to be your starting point.
Thank you very much. Can we then move to the last domain, domain number 5? What are your recommendations and your challenges that you have seen, Debbie, on this one?
Thank you, Pascal. So 3 broad areas for this one. So it's the planning, it's the execution of the engagement, and then the reporting of the engagement. And I think in terms of planning, it's thinking about, do you need to engage the public in planning particular reviews? If you do, that's obviously going to potentially increase the length of time it takes to prepare your terms of reference for a particular engagement, and you need to factor that into your planning, and thinking about how you can do that effectively. Thinking about your engagement objective and scoping, considering laws and regulations, both in terms of what you are able to do as an internal audit function, but how that actually impacts the audit area that's under review and how you need to take that into account. Whether a review should be an assurance review or an advisory review. And that's quite important in terms of making sure you've got the right balance between assurance reviews and advisory. Certainly in the UK, we have to provide an annual opinion on the overall governance, risk management and control framework, and we have to plan on the basis of giving that annual opinion. And therefore, we need to make sure that we've got the right level of assurance to be able to inform that opinion. So for us, that's really important. And also there might be pressure from management to do something as an advisory piece that really should be an assurance piece because they know it's going to be bad news. So we just need to look out for management trying to do that. Thinking about at the start of the audit, do we need to limit the scope of this review? Do we need to think about, do we know already that there are areas that we can't cover, that we won't be able to look at, maybe because of the laws and regulations that are in place? And do we need to make that clear up front? There's always that potential that you give false assurance because people think that you have looked at more than you actually have. So being really upfront about that can be helpful. But at the same time, we also need to be flexible, and there may be things that come up as you start work on an engagement that mean you need to go back and revisit that terms of reference, and we should be open to do that with agreement from management. Evaluation criteria, making sure that we're using the most relevant evaluation criteria in planning our work. And is it adequate? Does it actually do what the organisation needs it to do, or if management just put it in place because it makes their life easier? If it's not adequate, we should be talking to management and the board about that and making sure we're using the right evaluation criteria in our reviews. And resourcing, this is always tricky, especially in a small audit team where you might have inexperienced team members in terms of, have you got the right skills and experience to carry out that review? And I think here it's whether what's the most appropriate course of action. So is it bringing in external resource to do the review and upskill your team at the same time? Is it that you delay the review until you can allocate it to someone else? Or is it that you use that review as a development opportunity and put in place extra support and coaching for the individual so that they're upskilled, but they're not doing it feeling as though they're being left on their own to do it, and that they've got the right support around them? But that can be a challenge to make sure that you can deliver all the work in the programme. Work programmes should be developed based on the planning that you've done, not just taking something as standard off the shelf, really tailoring it to your particular circumstance. And then in terms of conducting the engagement, making sure that you don't just identify relevant, reliable and sufficient evidence, but that it is effective and it is sufficient, and that it will enable you to reach a conclusion and that you don't need further information. Thinking about your findings, that's where the evaluation criteria doesn't match the condition in place at the time of the audit. thinking about the significance of that and whether that needs reporting. One area that we're really focused on at the moment is root cause analysis. So we've just produced some additional guidance and are doing some training for our auditors, because that's not something that they've routinely been using as part of their evaluation of findings. So something that we're upskilling people on. Looking at recommendations and action plans and collaborating with management. I know several audit teams that just provide the findings at the moment. So thinking about how you will work with management to develop those action plans and make sure that they're appropriate. In terms of engagement conclusions, mistakes happen. It is a fact of life. There may be evidence that comes to light after you've issued the report that would have changed your opinion had it been available. So you need to make sure that there is enough evidence to reach a conclusion. And where an error or omission has been made, you need to think about what the impact is on that particular piece of work. How significant is it? Is it something that means you need to reissue the report and report to the board that there's been a mistake? And setting that out in the charter in terms of when that's appropriate would be sensible. Finally, looking at communicating the results. In the final engagement communication, it's important to include if you are not conforming with the standards, and that's a new requirement this year. So making sure that you're thinking about that in terms of the completion of the audit work, and whether you can make a statement to say you have conformed, or whether you need to make a statement that you haven't conformed, I think is important. And finally, making sure that you have an appropriate process in place for following up recommendations. In some of our customers, management will do that, but we still have to sign them off and say that we are satisfied that the risk has been mitigated, to make sure that we are comfortable that the recommendation has been implemented and it's done what we wanted it to do. So making sure there is a clear process for that, I think, is important. And I'll stop there, Pascal.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Time is running, so I think it's time now to take some questions from the participants, and we have already a few of them. So the first one is, I think, quite interesting, and we have been touching a little bit on this point today. It's about what if the management do not want to engage in line with the essential condition of the standards. So what is your recommendation? We start with you, Debbie, maybe, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Pascal. I think back on this when I saw the draft standards, and the domain 3 was phrased very differently, I think, in the draft standard, and it was almost as though they were telling the board what they had to do. And I think the IA recognised from the feedback was not something they could do. And hence the language in the final version of the standards changed. I think if they're not going to engage, it is difficult. I think it's that softly keep plugging away. I think the audit charter gives you a real opportunity to set out what the roles and responsibilities should be, and gives you something to keep having the conversations with the board and senior management. If they don't want to engage, why? What is the problem? What is the issue that they have with internal audit? Is it that internal audit is seen as something they have to have, or do they not think they're getting the value from it? And I think that having those ongoing conversations is really important to get underneath the reasons why they're not engaging, and try and work out different approaches to getting them involved and more in internal audit.
Thank you. Jens, what would be your recommendation?
I think an internal audit function can show results, and by results you can convince management about the advantages that an internal audit function has. If you identify weak processes or financial situations that can be improved, this is a main thing where internal audit functions can contribute to results. show ways of saving money, saving resources, and this is kind of an effect that management cannot ignore.
Thank you. I think, I'm sorry, Debbie, but I think the next question is for you, as you mentioned in the introduction that you are preparing for an EQA. So do you have some tips why you are preparing? What have you found? What can you share with the participants?
So I would say start as soon as you don't leave it to the last minute. The approach we've taken to our EQA is to have it in 2 phases. So we're actually working with the Chartered IIA in the UK, and they've already done the first phase of our EQA. And the first phase was what they called a readiness review. So this was to follow up on the actions from our last EQA, but for the new global standards. So it gave us an early heads up in terms of since the last EQA, but also any potential areas that, unless we get them resolved by the 1st of April, may cause us problems when we do come to have the EQA. So early engagement. I mean, we went down the route of bringing in an external assessor. We will have a team of 3 people to our assessment. But we've had ongoing dialogue with them and we've kept talking to them. And as we've had issues or questions come up, we them about it so that we're getting feedback before we get anywhere near the EQA actually happening. And I think that's been really useful for us.
Thank you. Any tip on your side, Jens? When is your next EQA on your side?
We had one after the old system quite recently, so therefore we have some time till the next external quality assessment.
All right, thank you. Another question. We have been speaking about many challenges, I think, today, but someone would like to know what has been the most challenges that you have experimented when you were implementing the new standards. What is your experience, Jens, maybe first?
Yeah, of course, what the audience also has voted for, domains we really has challenging standards to apply, and also, as I explained, developing a strategy for the internal audit function that is in line with the organization's goals is quite a difficult task. So therefore, this strategy cannot be done by artificial intelligence or something like that. This is really core work for your internal audit unit to develop a strategy that fits to the organization and has an impact on the internal audit function.
Thank you. Maybe let's take another question. We still have a few minutes to go. How the overall full achievement rating is feasible in the public sector? Are we not shooting ourselves in the foot, changing the scale? Debbie, may I ask your point of view on this one?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we talk about
Yes.
continuous improvements, and yet, you know, you get to a point where you fully conform with everything, then what is the incentive to continually improve your audit service? We need to remember that the rating system was put in place by the IIA. They've chosen to go ratings. Why they've decided on doing that change, I honestly don't know. But I think we're not aiming for full achievements in our EQA. We'd be quite happy with generally conformed because we think that's right for us. And I think you have to do that kind of cost benefit analysis of where do you want to get to on the scale, and have that conversation with the board and senior management in terms of, you know, if we wanted to get to what's that going to cost us, and is it actually worth it? Do we actually feel as though we need to be at that level, or is generally conforms the right level for us. And so, you know, for some organizations, they may aspire and they may see that they need to be in that top box. But for me personally, I think generally conforms is a happy place to be.
Thank you. And maybe Jens, a very last one before the conclusion. What about the public interest? What's the impact based on you for the public sector?
Yeah, public interest is an important factor in the public sector. Whenever something happens in a public sector organization, press is asking for the opinion of internal audit. So internal audit reports are demanded by the public, and therefore we have to be sure to follow the standards, give an independent and objective result about the situation, and we should be aware that this report does not only reach our management, our seniors, but also might appear in the press.
Thank you very much. So if I conclude a little bit about the discussion that we had today, I think that listening to you, there are a lot of complexity, that's for sure. It's not easy, let's face it. But I think we all believe that this is quite important for the profession to look serious by applying these new standards. And as mentioned by all of you, I think it's key to have the right charter. So the charter is really the heart of the profession. So let's make sure that the charter is really well defined, well described, well detailed. It's also very important to make sure that the strategy and the objective of the internal audit function are aligned with the organization, because that's also a nice way to get the buy-in from the management, from the governing bodies, and from everyone. So I think this is another very important point. Another point is very important also is that I think we all need to advocate about these standards and make sure that the local regulation are adapted and are aligned with the new standards. I think it's the job for all of us as well. So another very important point. And last but not the least, for those that still are in the process of implementation, I heard also from you that there are many interesting tools on the IIA Global website that you could have a look at, like Project Charter, Toolkit, and things like that. So on this, I would like to thank our two speakers, but I also would like to thank all the participants of the working groups that have helped us issuing this paper that you can find on ECIA website, and that details what has been discussed today, domain by domain. You can have a list of the challenges, the recommendation that we have gathered with all the members of this working group. And finally, I know some of you are really interested of having a CPE document. So please fill in the document on Slido, or use the QR code, or even go back to Slido tomorrow or even Sunday. We will keep it open to give you time to fill in the questionnaire so that you can get your certificate. So on this, I would like again to thank you very much, Debbie and Jens. Thank you for the insight. Thank you for your support, and thank you for your involvement in this working group and today in this webinar. Thank you, and all have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.